So, in terms of things that were and were not announced at D23, we are now up to the last American park, the original Disney park, Disneyland in California. There's a fair bit of controversy around one of these announcements. There are also some attractions and other areas that Disney is actively considering that were not announced at D23. And then there are the announcements themselves. Though Disneyland is one of the American parks with the fewest large announcements this year, the other park was Epcot. It surely does not mean that there's a lack of news or intrigue here. There's absolutely plenty. As I've mentioned on other recent episodes, we're a little out of our usual posting schedule. The last episode went up on Thursday night. This one is going up sometime on Monday. Instead of posting once a week on Sunday, I'm simply posting episodes as soon as I finish them, which has meant 2 or 3 new episodes a week for the month of August. We will likely be back on our usual release schedule in September. And before we jump in today, I need to thank another round of recent Bandcamp subscribers. These here are the people who keep this whole enterprise going. I'm grateful for each and every subscriber over on Bandcamp for supporting our show. A special note of gratitude is going out today to Bo, Mary, Art, and Stephanie. Thanks to each of you for supporting this podcast and all we do here. And now, let's kick into the show. One of the most interesting things about this year's D23 announcements wasn't what was announced, but what wasn't. Disney has said that it intends to build everything that was announced in some form in the next 5 years. So it seems we have a reasonable roadmap, particularly in Florida, for how the American resorts will expand in the near future. In other recent episodes, we've explored what was not announced for various Florida parks. But for the California parks, there were some noticeable projects that were left out of the announcements, including 2 big ones. The first big one was that there was no announcement for any meaningful redo of Tomorrowland. Just as in Florida, Tomorrowland has elements that are now unused or outdated. Of all the areas inside Disneyland, this is the area that needs the most attention. Magic Eye Theater remains mostly empty. The old Carousel Theater remains mostly underused. The second story now is a DVC lounge, but most of this building now no longer serves the needs of guests. Across the way, Buzz Lightyear could be freshened up a bit, perhaps even with a new theme. The old Starcade has been converted into an event space, largely for private parties, and technically, just outside of Tomorrowland, over at the edge of Fantasyland, the area that used to house the motorboat cruise remains empty. During the Finding Nemo subs redevelopment, much of the waterway for that old attraction was filled in with dirt and landscaping. But part of that old waterway remains there, with, I'm pretty sure, some of the original track below the surface. The old dock and loading area now has some tables for quick service meals as well as a snack booth. And all of this together, from the Carousel Theater to the Magic Eye Theater to the dock and green space, remains deeply underutilized land in a park where capacity remains a problem. The Magic Kingdom remains the most visited park in the world. In 2023, the Magic Kingdom received 17.7 million visitors. But Disneyland, a meaningfully smaller park, was second with 17.3 million visitors. That is, both Disneyland and the Magic Kingdom are both just above 17 million. The Magic Kingdom is roughly 25% larger in terms of acres than Disneyland, but the 2 parks have almost identical attendance numbers, which means that Disneyland often feels more crowded, so these bits of unused or underused space or attraction areas could make a difference in the overall feel of the park. Beyond this, something needs to be done about the People Mover track, either repair it or remove it. And for long-time West Coast fans, the People Mover track removal is always a touchy issue. We've talked about the possibility of a new People Mover system from the Disneyland entrance plaza over to a yet-to-be-built Eastern Gateway parking structure, and if that actually happens, the time to announce the removal of the People Mover track inside the park is with an announcement of a new People Mover system that will be built just outside the park. And if that is part of the overall plan here, then maybe the freshening of Tomorrowland might be a project for Disneyland's 75th anniversary, which is less than 6 years away in July 2030. The second big omission was that, as far as I can tell, there were no announcements for the key land elements of the Disney Forward project. The Disney Forward plan mainly focuses on land outside of Disneyland and outside of DCA. On the west side of the parks, there are 2 parking lot areas near the Disneyland Hotel that likely will be turned into expansion pads for Disneyland and DCA. And on the other side of the parks, there's 1 expansion area that should become a new parking structure as part of the Eastern Gateway project, which maybe has a People Mover project attached to it. There is also that 73-acre Toy Story parking lot over by the convention center that can be turned into a shopping and entertainment district or even a 3rd theme park. This area is about 7 acres smaller than DCA, so there's a lot of land there. Almost surely the first element that needs to be built is the east side parking structure, which would then allow for other existing parking areas to close. Here's how I think all of this would work. That new parking structure would be for day guests to the parks, which then would allow the current Mickey and Friends and Pixar Pals parking structures to be for day guests, hotel guests, and downtown Disney guests. That is, a new parking structure first needs to be built, so Disney then can convert current surface parking areas into attraction, dining, and perhaps new hotel space. But nothing concerning any of those areas of land was touched on at all at D23, even though Disney now has zoning clearance to develop those existing surface parking areas towards more interesting ends. Everything that was announced for California appears to be slotted for space inside the 2 existing parks, even including the new Avengers Land, which will take a lot of space. The good news here is this. This leaves all the key parcels on the Disneyland Forward project open for further developments and new attractions. But this also likely means that Disney is not getting to those parcels anytime soon, as there will be a multi-stepped and very expensive path to get there, which likely starts with a reconfiguration of parking, essentially moving current surface parking into existing or yet-to-be-built parking structures. So these, I think, are the 2 large omissions. I have a couple smaller ones we'll talk about later, but now let's look at what was actually announced for Disneyland. Our first announcement concerns a presentation by a sophisticated animatronic carefully arranged to embody the movements and look of Walt Disney. So let's start with a question. Where are there displays to learn about Walt Disney as a person? Well, outside of the 2 amazing museums, the Walt Disney Hometown Museum in Marceline, Missouri, and the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco, the largest display of artifacts and images that present the life of Walt Disney is at Walt Disney World in Florida, specifically a lovely multi-room display at Hollywood Studios, which is not only a park that Walt never visited, but also a park initially designed 2 decades after his death. There are many markers of Walt Disney's life at Disneyland, which is the only finished park that Walt ever visited. The apartment above the firehouse is where Walt stayed when he visited the park, including for the press preview day in 1955. The Golden Horseshoe Saloon is where Walt and Lily celebrated their 30th anniversary 4 days before the park opened. The Mark Twain is where Walt and a friend or two, such as Art Linkletter, used to relax after the park closed. There's the petrified tree that he bought, at least as the popular story goes, as a gift to his wife that's now in Frontierland. There's the steam engines that he piloted. There's the partner statue in the hub, created by Blaine Gibson, an artist who worked for Walt from 1939 up until Walt's death in 1966. And there was the 100 Years of Wonder exhibit in the Main Street Opera House, though that exhibit was mostly focused on the evolution of the company as a whole over the previous century. But there's no large permanent display in Disneyland to present the life and accomplishments of Walt Disney as there is in those two museums. I haven't seen the animatronic personally, but Brian Stelter, a reporter for Fortune magazine, saw it and wrote about his experience in a recent article. Inside a boxy, heavily secured warehouse building in Glendale, California, he began, behind an unassuming black curtain, Walt Disney is being brought back to life. A life-size model of Disney, who died in 1966, is wearing one of the man's favorite ties and a pair of his old shoes. The model is leaning on a desk in a replica of his old office, where the entertainment industry pioneer created iconic animations and dreamed up theme parks like Disneyland. A special light is pointed at the model's face to draw out a twinkle in Disney's eye. Stelter met with longtime Imagineer Tom Fitzgerald, who explained that the Walt figure would rise from his desk and discuss his life. Elsewhere, the Disney company has explained that Walt's speech would come from archival audio of Walt himself, not a voice actor or an AI approximation of his speech patterns. Beyond this, the team developing this figure have been very careful to make its presentation as lifelike as possible. Anyone who's watched Walt's old introductions from his weekly TV show knows that Walt was fairly expressive with his hands and arms. He would often raise his hands to emphasize a point or rub his hands together, one over the other, when discussing an emotional moment in a film or a story. Fitzgerald's team has used new technology to animate the hands and fingers to make their movement appear more realistic. They've also used new materials and techniques to create the skin for this figure so that Walt's face will appear more lifelike when guests zoom in on it with their various smartphones. In a conversation with Josh D'Amaro, Stetler learned that this animatronic was envisioned as a key piece of Disneyland's 70th anniversary next summer. Shortly after this conversation at the D23 event before 12,000 fans, D'Amaro announced that Imagineering would install the Walt figure into the Opera House. The Opera House stage utilizes a turntable, which will be able to rotate between shows. Though this wasn't explained at the expo, I've since learned that the present plan is to feature Walt by himself at the Opera House, and then once demand decreases, to alternate performances between Walt and then Lincoln using that turntable. My guess is that for the 70th, if this plan moves forward, the stage would mostly, if not exclusively, be arranged for the Walt Disney Show, and then later the company can promote the return of Lincoln perhaps the following year. During the D23 announcement at the Honda Center, D'Amaro asked a member of the Disney family in the audience to stand, and this was the first hint that there was trouble somewhere in these plans. And here's where things get a little complicated. Up until 1981, the Disney family owned the name, likeness, and portrait of Walt Disney, or more specifically, these rights were held by Retlaw, which was primarily a Disney family-owned company. The Disney Company, which is separate from the Disney family, regularly used Walt's image and name to promote films and the parks, but it paid Retlaw a royalty on them. In 1981, the Disney Company purchased these rights, along with the rights to the Disneyland monorail and railroad, which had been managed by Retlaw from the family, essentially folding all Retlaw holdings into the Walt Disney Company. For this, Retlaw received $46.2 million in Disney stock, which was distributed to Walt's widow, Lillian, Walt's children, and other relatives, with some of the money also going to charity. At this time, for the Disney Company, the primary goal was to consolidate all of the Disneyland attractions under the Disney Company without this unusual arrangement of leaving some attractions originally owned by Walt personally under family ownership. But over time, the name and likeness rights to Walt Disney became more valuable. When a museum, for example, wants to use an artistic likeness of Walt for an exhibit, logo, or souvenir, it needs to be cleared through the Disney Company who owns those rights. But Disney, after the purchase of Retlaw, could use the likeness of Walt as it felt appropriate. So what was the sign that there was trouble in the announcement of the Walt Disney figure at the D23 event earlier this month? Well, the person who stood up to acknowledge the new installation and thereby giving it his tacit approval wasn't one of Walt's grandchildren. Rather, it was one of Roy's grandchildren. Specifically, it was Roy P. Disney. And just for clarity, let me break down the names because there's a lot of Roy Disneys. Roy O. Disney was Walt's older brother and lifelong business partner at the studio. Roy O. Disney then had one child, Roy E. Disney. Roy E. Disney is perhaps best known for helping to arrange the Disney animation renaissance in the 1990s with such hits as The Lion King. Among his personal passion projects that he oversaw were Fantasia 2000, which he believed was an extension of Walt and Roy's original classic, and Destino, a project started under the auspices of Walt and Roy Disney and then finished many decades later under him. Roy E. Disney had 4 children, including Roy P. Disney. Roy P. Disney has strong memories of both his grandfather, Roy O. Disney, and his grand-uncle, Walt, including playing on the sets of Mary Poppins and sitting with Walt in the control area as a man with a jetpack flew above Tomorrowland. He was 9 years old when Walt died and 14 when Roy O. Disney died. After college, Roy P. Disney worked for the Disney Company, including a period in Imagineering. But after that, he shifted away from the company and found for a while his own life in investing. But midlife, when he was in his 50s, he started to reconnect with the company. I've talked with Roy P. Disney a number of times and can tell you at this point in his life, he has a deep appreciation for all the things accomplished by Walt and Roy O. Disney, even if during an earlier period of his life, he felt the need to find his own identity outside of the long shadow cast by his family. That is, though I haven't talked to Roy P. Disney in a while, I'm pretty sure that his intentions in showing up at the D23 event were to honor his great-uncle. Perhaps with a second connection being this, I'm pretty sure that Roy P. Disney is the only grandkid of either Walt or Roy who worked at Imagineering, though that wasn't mentioned on the night of the presentation. On stage, Josh D'Amaro explained that "We've brought the members of the Disney family along with us for every step of the journey," and then added that Roy P. had visited the Imagineering campus recently to see our progress. And then Roy P. stood up to wave to the audience. He's a tall man in his mid-60s with short-clipped salt and pepper hair and a narrow beard. My first thought at this time was that this surely wasn't Disney's first choice to show family support for this particular project. Their first choice almost surely would have been one of Walt's grandchildren, as they had a closer relationship with Walt. From the various bands and celebrities on stage, it was clear that nearly all of those on stage simply drove in from Southern California. A few key people were flown in, but most on stage could easily get to the Honda Center by car. Roy P. Disney lives in Southern California, but some of Walt's grandchildren also live in Southern California, which likely was the telltale sign that this announcement wasn't sitting well with some or perhaps all of them. The following day, Leo Holzer, who runs a very active Facebook page on the history of the Disney Company, posted excerpts that he had with Joanna Disney Miller, who is the second oldest of Walt Disney's grandkids and who knew Walt until she was 10 years old. In Holzer's post, here is what Joanna said. I am overwhelmed and angry. Mom would be ready to fight. I think it shows a lack of respect for Grandpa. Walt is already branded and used by the company every day. Yet that he exists in films that was for his company, and we have the real thing to see and listen to. We do not need to turn him into a robot. I rather feel he's being used, victimized by the company. As someone else posted, they will be able to make him do and say what they choose. The moments are not necessarily his. Already the smile is wrong. I had thought he had built the company, and that Grandpa would be amazed at what it encompasses now. I thought that the company, Bob Iger, was sensitive to the memory of Walt and the sentiments of his daughter, my mother, Diane. In a later post, Joanna urged fans to support her in opposing the installation of the Walt animatronic at Disneyland. Everyone, she wrote, please stop the madness. Do not let them turn Grandpa into a robot. My mom tried to stop this years ago, and they respected her wishes. There is plenty of film so people can see and hear him talk. Then she ended her post by saying, please help protect the memory and legacy of Grandpa. Joanna is one of the grandchildren most involved in preserving the history of her grandfather and is involved with the Disney Family Museum. And now this puts the Disney Company into a difficult spot. The company sometimes asks for Disney family support for certain business issues to help shift public or investor sentiment. Most recently, 4 of Walt's grandchildren signed a letter stating that they supported Bob Iger over Nelson Peltz and Peltz's efforts to remake the Disney board. In retrospect, Joanna's post now makes it appear that Disney was likely aware of this controversy and simply avoiding it by including Roy P. Disney at the presentation. But there's also this on the other side. Walt's own vision was to honor U.S. presidents by creating a Hall of Presidents. At the time that Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln opened at the New York World's Fair, all of Lincoln's grandchildren had passed. There were some great-grandkids, but they were born long after Lincoln's passing and had no specific memories of him. But Walt's initial ambition for this project wasn't simply to present Lincoln, but to present all of the presidents, including those who were living or recently passed, on stage in animatronic form. He was simply unable to find the funds to do this during his lifetime. So now there's a difficult decision or negotiation for the Disney Company to engage. The Disney Company has the contractual rights to create and present this animatronic if they so choose. But there may be some deep cost associated with it, such as the loss of support from key Disney family members for future business efforts. There may be some limited public backlash to this project, undercutting the project's main aim, which is to honor Walt. It may be possible to persuade Walt's grandkids to support this project, though I'm not sure that this is a realistic outcome, or there may be a way to reuse the underlying mechanics of this animatronic for a different presentation that doesn't feature Walt in animatronic form. So, a couple weeks back, when we started these discussions about the D23 announcements, I said that there were 2 controversies already bubbling up, one of which might alter an announcement, another might cancel an announcement. The controversy that might alter an announcement is the removal of Rivers of America for the Cars installation at the Magic Kingdom. I've been told that there are at least some conversations going on about the possibility, be it a small one, to significantly shorten the river at the Magic Kingdom, leaving the Liberty Square riverboat and the dock instead of removing the river altogether. I can't tell you at all what the odds are of this actually happening or how serious these discussions are at the moment, but I've been told that after that lukewarm reception at D23, this has at least been discussed. I feel it's a long shot, but for the record, personally, I'd prefer the option of leaving a shortened river there, as that preserves part of the long-standing visual identity of the park. The second controversy is this: the objections from the Disney family about the Walt animatronic, which, if these objections become loud enough, I think they can cancel or deeply delay its installation into the park. I would think, or at least hope, that at this point, Disney executives are talking with the grandkids about their objections to the project, but generally, one brand element of the current Disney company is to present, preserve, and honor their connection with Walt. Walt regularly appears in Disney-sponsored museum exhibits. His image appears in many places in the parks. His voice was included in 2 recent Epcot nighttime spectaculars, Luminous and Epcot Forever, so it doesn't help the Disney company to engage in a public battle with Walt's grandkids over how Walt is presented in the parks, even if Disney holds the contractual rights to present him as they want. So what's at stake in all this? Well, there's the actual development cost of this animatronic versus the political, social, and brand capital that the company may lose if Disney moves forward without some buy-in from Walt's side of the family. So this is another area to watch as we move from 2024 to 2025, which is also the 70th anniversary of Disney's opening. And just to point out the obvious, without the Walt Disney Show, which is called Walt Disney: A Magical Life, there's little new to highlight in the park for its 70th birthday. So there's a small mess brewing here, with no easy way to quickly clean it all up. Our next segment is both an announcement and a mystery. The announcement is the opening date for Tiana's Bayou Adventure. For months now, based on construction progress, we've been saying that Tiana's Bayou Adventure would likely push to open shortly before Thanksgiving, and that turns out to be true. It'll open on November 15th, which will give park operations about a week and a half to run the attraction with actual guests before crowds arrive for the Thanksgiving holiday. The area will lose its old name, Critter Country, which thematically combined Splash Mountain with the mini adventures of Winnie the Pooh, to now take on a new area name, Bayou Country. But in this, there's a couple of mysteries. The first one has to do with the return of, well, sort of, the Country Bears in Disneyland and in DCA. Out in Florida earlier this summer, the Country Bears got new costumes and a new show. They're now performing all kinds of Disney standards with a country western flair. It's a lovely show. A little extra Country Bear flair makes sense in Florida, where the Bears have performed continuously for over 5 decades. But in California, they were removed back in 2001 to make way for a new ride. During that period, one early ride proposed for this building was a soapbox derby attraction featuring the Country Bears, with Henry as the race's announcer. But that attraction eventually gave way to the mini adventures of Winnie the Pooh, based on the perennial popularity of its characters. Even after Pooh took over the building, there was a group of fans who fondly remembered the Country Bears, but the Bears as an attraction hasn't been in this particular park for 23 years. Recently, however, these bears have again started to show up in small ways. Back in May, over at DCA just outside Grizzly Rapids, a large statue of Big Al showed up near the queue area, even though presumably he has absolutely nothing to do with that ride. And then over summer, Disney announced that the Hungry Bear restaurant would be rethemed to become the Hungry Bear Barbecue Jamboree, with the Country Bears worked into the advertising. The backstory here is this. The food is inspired by the Country Bears in their travels throughout the greatest music halls in the United States. Most of the food should be Southern options, which ties well into the Bayou Country name for this land. The meals themselves look somewhat similar to those at Regal Eagle out at Epcot, including being served on small metal trays. And it makes sense to have a barbecue restaurant back in Disneyland after the park's last popular barbecue restaurant, Big Thunder Ranch, closed 8 years ago to make way for Galaxy's Edge. But retheming this eatery to the Country Bears is a little more curious. Most guests under the age of 25 have no memories of the Country Bear attraction in the California park. I imagine most casual visitors to the California park couldn't tell you the name of any one of the Country Bears, let alone point to the area that was once their home. So why then introduce the Country Bears as part of a revised restaurant if the Country Bears are no longer featured in a park attraction? I don't think I have a whole lot of answers here, but just to point out the obvious, New Orleans Square thematically flows well into Bayou Country, including the barbecue restaurant. But putting the Bears back into the park after a 2-decade absence perhaps suggests that Disney is considering adding something more substantial with those same Bears, though exactly what that is might be left to be determined. I will point out that over at DCA, Grizzly Peak is one of the few areas that remains without any meaningful IP, and therefore lacks a good opportunity to sell IP-related plush, t-shirts, hats, and so on. I will also point out again that Disney explored other attraction plans for the Bears before removing them from the California park, so a future return of the Country Bears in California doesn't necessarily mean bringing back a stage show. The proposed replacement ride a couple decades ago for the Country Bear Playhouse was a soapbox derby attraction called Critter Country 500, featuring the Country Bears. This was an attraction idea from around 2000 that would have created a dark ride where guests raced against the bears, speeding around in unique homemade cars. This ride clearly would have repurposed the exact animatronics from the Country Bear show, including Henry and Sammy as the race's announcers, and Gomer still seated as though he was playing an upright piano, but now his hands would be on a steering wheel for what looks to be a turn-of-the-century vehicle that is half railroad engine and half automobile. That is, I'm just pointing out that Disney has already explored ways to bring the Bears back into the California parks, and that these ideas are not necessarily tied to their original stage show or even a musical performance. So that there, I suppose, is something to file away in some dark, rarely accessed area of your brain in case it's helpful later. And as long as we're in pure speculation mode, you might add a post-it note to this filing in your brain to cross-reference it with the question, what IP, if any, will Disney eventually add to Grizzly Peak? Again, for clarity, all this about future possibilities with the Country Bears is a puff of wishful thinking wrapped up in a ball of blue sky and tied up finely with a questionable bow of future guesswork. You should take this last bit as nothing more than that. But to get all this back on track, perhaps with a little less speculation, there is now one attraction that is a thematic outlier in Bayou Country, which is that Winnie the Pooh attraction, which doesn't take place anywhere near Louisiana or by those salt domes that now comprise the log ride's exterior. I'm pretty sure that even in its current animated form, the Disney Winnie the Pooh stories are still supposed to be set in England. So I'm sort of guessing here that the Pooh ride may be on the future chopping block, at least for this section of the park. Otherwise, I think Imagineering would have come up with a name for the area other than Bayou Country that would have somehow also included Pooh in the same way that Critter Country included both Splash Mountain and the Bears, and then later also included Winnie the Pooh. The Pooh attraction at Disneyland never has a long wait. It's a pleasant ride, but every other iteration of a Pooh in-park attraction is better than the one at Disneyland, with the Honey Hunt version in Tokyo coming in first by a whole lot, and the Mini Adventures incarnation over at the Magic Kingdom second, though feel free to write in with your list of reasons as to why the attraction in Hong Kong should have that second spot. Anyway, the name change here at Disneyland is a hint that Disney might be eyeing Pooh's current location for something else, something maybe a little more tied into the idea of Bayou Country. And before you ride into Disney with a Save Pooh rant, let me suggest that this would be a reasonably easy ride to move. And here again, against my own better judgment, I'm moving into pure speculation, nothing more. At Disneyland, the Mini Adventures of Winnie the Pooh is simply a bunch of show stages with no complex animatronics, no complex ride system. Some of these stages are nothing more than painted flats and projected effects. Beyond this, that ride system, it's just a set of easily movable ride vehicles, a buzz bar, and some partition doors between show areas. Even the show building itself is not particularly large by Disney standards. There are better themed areas to put a Winnie the Pooh ride, possibly even an updated version of the Winnie the Pooh ride. Already in this episode, we've talked about underused land at the periphery of Fantasyland, such as the old motorboat cruise load area, assuming that patch of water gets filled in. I'm pretty sure there's even more than enough room in Toontown for an entrance facade and a show building as well, maybe combined with a Winnie the Pooh play area. Just as a side note, back in the 1990s, Toontown was the original proposed location for a Pooh ride at Disneyland, which was then swapped out for Roger Rabbit's Cartoon Spin, leaving Pooh to take over the Country Bear Playhouse once the Bear's musical engagement came to an end. And for clarity, I have no insider knowledge of any of this. I'm just pointing out that there are ways to move the Pooh attraction to an area that better matches its theme, and a move wouldn't require a lot of heavy lifting. Disney, as I'm sure you've noticed, doesn't often move old attractions. Mostly retired attractions are raised, sold, stored, or demoed. But recently, Disney moved Flick's Flyers at DCA to the back of the park where it became the inside-out emotional whirlwind, with some minor retheming. So there's some, though slight, recent precedent for something like this. And as long as we're talking about what happens to old attractions, though I'm pretty sure all the stages for the old Country Bear Playhouse were demoed, most or perhaps all of the animatronic bears, at least as of 10 years ago, were created, saved, and placed in WDI storage without being stripped for parts or repurposed. It's possible that something's happened to them in the intervening 10 years. It's always possible that these stored figures were used for spare parts to maintain the remaining bear attractions in Florida and Tokyo, but 10 years ago they were there. And now I realize that this segment has become something of a long rambling digression of various pipe dreams and obscure trivia. But the four main takeaways from this are these. Tiana's Bayou Adventure opens on November 15th at Disneyland. The Country Bears have rather oddly been popping up again in the California parks. The new name for the area is Bayou Country, and as there's no obvious way to fit the British character of Winnie the Pooh under the Southern American Bayou theme, it suggests, again as pure speculation, that this attraction might be removed, replaced, or relocated elsewhere in the park, though of course this is simply an educated guess, and there's nothing official to point to that. But let's end this episode on some quick notes that have a whole lot more surety around them than some of those possibilities that I floated in the last segment. Just as at Hollywood Studios in Florida, Smuggler's Run at Disneyland will get a ride update for the Millennium Falcon, this time with The Mandalorian and Grogu. For years now, when new films or new series have been released, Star Tours has updated their offerings to include new characters and new locations. This same type of update is now being arranged for Smuggler's Run. The Mando and Grogu film is set to drop in 2026, as is their new adventure on Smuggler's Run. Disney reps in an interview confirmed that recent changes to Peter Pan's flight in the Magic Kingdom would also come to Disneyland. These concern just one area of the ride, the one that features highly caricatured depictions of Native Americans, similar to those depictions in the film. In Florida, the replacement figures for these scenes are tasteful. Tiger Lily is on model from the film, and the rest of her tribe appears as thoughtful presentations of Native Americans as they likely would be presented in an animated film today, as opposed to other ride changes for cultural sensitivity issues, such as in Pirates of the Caribbean, Where the replacement, in ways, detracts from the overall narrative mood of the experience, the presentation here in Peter Pan is thoughtful, stylish, and contributes to the tone and sophistication of the ride. I think that this in Florida was very well done. Lastly, let's touch on Murphy the Dragon. The phantasmic dragon on fire was repeatedly a joke during the Deadpool segment of the D23 presentation. The joke that Deadpool made, standing next to Josh D'Amaro on stage, not once but twice, was that Josh was on fire. And then after a pause, like the dragon in Phantasmic. But in retrospect, the inclusion of the dragon twice at the D23 presentation only highlights that there's no announcement of a dragon substitute, whether that being a fire-breathing head on a crane or a new animatronic to replace the departed Murphy, which is sorely missing in the California show. Perhaps this might be another element that is later announced for Disney's 70th. And before we go, one update to our last episode about DCA. Since the episode was posted, Scott Gustin, a reporter for the Orlando Sentinel with the Disney Beat, has announced that the red car trolley in DCA will close early in 2025. This is the 1920s style trolley car that runs from Buena Vista Street down through Hollywood Boulevard. This likely means that construction is about to begin on the Avengers Campus expansion. We have also speculated that just on the other side of those trolley tracks, Disney might put the Avatar area into the place where the back of Hollywoodland now stands. If there's an announcement for the closure of the Monsters Incorporated attraction, you can be pretty sure that the Avatar experience is going here and that it will be built alongside the Avengers Campus expansion. If we don't get that announcement, then construction on DCA projects will start with Avengers Campus. And one last thing. If the red car doesn't return, which is likely, this means that Avengers Campus can also expand into the barn storage areas for those red cars. Without the red cars in the park, this leaves open the door for Avengers Campus to continue expanding at some future point, perhaps taking over land now used by the Hyperion Theater for some type of additional Marvel experience, though that, of course, would be many years away. And with that, hopefully, we now have a full list of announcements as they relate to Disneyland. We have a list of controversies as well as possible areas to watch in the park, and we also have a short list of what wasn't announced, but might be under consideration for the park. In general, as in our other Future of episodes, we have a list of issues and topics to watch as we move forward, as all 6 of the American parks are clearly headed towards some interesting changes. I'll be back later this week with another episode. Over the last 2.5 weeks and over the last 7 episodes, we've covered the state of the Disney company and we've looked at the future of the 6 American parks along with the Florida resort as a whole. We have one last area to explore after all the announcements of the expo, and that is Disney films, TV, and other entertainment. It's been taking me a few days to finish each of these episodes, but these episodes together should give us a very good base to move forward with our discussions and explorations, as much of the company, the parks in particular, feel like they're shifting into a period where their identities will change and expand as we move toward 2030. So I will probably see you again this weekend to talk about all of that. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, Until sometime later this week, this is Todd James Pierce.